Good evening. As we all know, the recent inhuman massacre of 9 members of the church in Charleston, South Carolina has raised issues for public debate, ranging from racism to arms control to mental illness and others. But little or nothing is usually said about the historical roots of racism, the legacy of the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, and frankly, the legacy of slavery. In this first historical sketch on this subject, we will attempt to examine, however briefly, the history of slavery. And it must be brief due to time and, of course, and space limitations. To examine it and to trace its development and to trace the curious, elusive, but real transformation of one basic idea, the idea of supremacy, and how supremacy has transformed itself into the idea of exceptionalism. For I think it is easy to say that the mass murderer of Charleston has had some kind of mental illness, but more elusive, but also I think more interesting, is to trace where these ideas come from, and to detect from the reaction of the ruling elites and their spokespersons their general attitude towards the idea of supremacy, which, as you know, was at the root of the mass murder. For example, most instructive is what the reaction by the chief of the FBI was, stating that the Charleston mass murder was not an act of terrorism, a statement deserving of contempt by anyone who still insists on, if you like, independent reasoning. For classifying the massacre into some kind of category other than terrorism implies the absolution and endorsement of the mass murders by the ruling cabal against hundreds, or rather thousands, of people outside the US, guilty of no other crime than refusing to submit to the exceptional nation. And let's not talk of ISIS, which, as just about everyone agrees, was or is a US direct or indirect creation for the purpose of destroying whatever was still left intact of various Middle East countries after sundry wars of liberation. Therefore, Obama's invitation to have a conversation about race rings hollow, because behind the issue of race lies a more important issue, at least in my view, that is the interpretation of the history of the United States. Now, to prepare for this historical sketch, I acquired some books from a publishing house in Georgia called the Confederate Press. And in particular, I read the short history of the Confederate States of America, written by its one and only President Jefferson Davis, and also partially some other publications by writers of the period, just before or after the Civil War. And as you know, there are still contrasting positions on this issue, namely, did the Confederate States have the right to secede from the Union? Was abolition the real issue, or instead an imperialist objective which was likely to be thwarted if the United States would split? The imperialist drive, already demonstrated by the attempt to annex Canada, by the annexation of Texas from Mexico, by the war against Mexico in 1848, and the consequent acquisition of half of the continental United States, and not much later by the invasion of Cuba, the annihilation of the independent kingdom of Hawaii, the war on the Philippines, and the annexation of Puerto Rico. To this question, it is, I think, impossible to give an objective answer, for any answer is strictly linked to personal ideology, which, of course, is shaped by the myriad of inputs from all sorts of sources, of which we all know. And to extricate one thread from the morass of ideas, I think we should accept that slavery was the issue of the Civil War, though it certainly did not seem to be so when the war was declared. The figure of Lincoln is controversial on this point, for by looking at the records he was ambivalent. When he took office, he declared that he had no intent to alter the structure of the Southern states, including no intent to abolish slavery. Except that the Southern elites had grown very suspicious of Lincoln and of the forces he represented, but when they attempted to claim their rights to secede, as printed and signed in black and white in the American Articles of Confederation, those rights were deemed null and irrelevant. And to strike a comparison familiar to most, after the Orange Revolution that dissolved the Soviet Union, there was an agreement, as you know, that NATO, which is an instrument of world domination, would stop at Germany. And as we all know, the agreement was declared null, and now NATO forces and military exercises are held within walking distance of Russian borders. Just about all of Eastern Europe has been made part of NATO, and the justification for breaking the agreement, that it was only verbal. So much for trust. To return to our story, I hope we all agree that slavery is and was not only unnatural, but a crime, and among crimes a most unchristian one. Well, if we do agree on this, we would be wrong. For here is what I found in a treatise titled Liberty and Slavery, written in 1856 by Albert Bledsoe, an intellectual bigwig in the South, and he said, in the 19th chapter of Leviticus, it is said, "Thou shalt love thy neighbors as thyself," and no greater love for this is anywhere inculcated in the New Testament. Yet, in the 25th chapter of the same book, it is written, "Of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, they shall be your possession, and you shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you. To inherit them for a possession, they shall be your bondsmen forever." In this very passage, the Hebrews are commanded to enter upon and take possession of the land of the Canaanites and to take them as slaves. Therefore, our divine concludes that slavery and the precept, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," are perfectly compatible. Today, the authority of the Leviticus on this and other issues fortunately does not carry much weight, but in an effort of squaring the circle, U.S. historians, especially in the 1930s, when some ex-slaves were still alive, thought that the best way to handle the controversy was to sanitize slavery itself. And how was this done? Simple. In one view, slavery was a pre-modern traditional institution that was not committed to profit-making, and as we will see, this lie is too large even for your large screen TV. Another view suggested that the planters were actually caring masters that considered their slaves almost as family members, albeit in a secondary position. A plantation was an idyll between happy slaves and caring masters. And this view was reinforced by Hollywood, especially with movies such as Gone with the Wind. The view of a benevolent slavery was supported by the fact that the slaves did not rebel, which of course is not true, for there were rebellions, though many individual acts where the actor was quickly dispatched, there were, or in some form of organized way also happened, as in the German coast uprising of New Orleans in 1811, or as in the case of Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. And it is clear from the literature and newspapers of the time that slave owners were extremely concerned about slave rebellions, and all sorts of measures were taken to ensure that rebellion was essentially impossible. Still, according to another view, slavery was independent from the rest of the modern economy and therefore had little influence on the economy of the United States. And therefore slavery would have ended naturally as a result of economic forces. And the summary of this rewriting of history is that the worst outcome of slavery was the denial to slaves of the rights of modern citizens. It was admitted as an error, but at the same time as an exception, out of line with the history of the United States, and as an exception, easily taken care of. 4. If slavery denied the rights of citizenship, give the ex-slaves the right of citizenship, place some African Americans in position of high political visibility and notoriety, even make one of them president, and the historical dilemma will be resolved and gone forever. Yet, the dilemma should be seen, I think, in the context of the contradiction between high ideals and hard practice that characterizes how the US were born as a country. For, according to the Declaration of Independence, all men were created equal, lest the black considered subhumans, Native Americans who were to be driven off their land, the poor who could not vote, and women, of course, who were not men. And not much later, the Constitution replaced the old authority with a new one, the old manorial ruling class by a new Republican ruling class, resting on the property and the social distinction that eventually also heredity, as much as the old one had done. But there was a difference, and the big one. The big difference was that Americans, at least those who set the tone to the country, could not admit the hereditary and social distinctions on which their society, like every other society, was based. And this created a gap between theory and practice, between the theory of equality that united the nation and the practice of competition with its unequal and selected results that kept the nation on the move and made it expand. This tension between theory and practice, between equality and competition, these tensions would never be admitted, let alone resolved. And the frauds and the illusions necessary to conceal it have become part of American history and of history itself. Now, some cynics maintain that there can be no success without fraud, which sounds a harsh statement in itself, except that fraud practice on the citizenship has become so much routine that now it is taken for granted. And those who expose the fraud by exposing some crimes have become, as you know, and are treated as enemies of the state or plain criminals. And for these examples there are too many even to mention. Which brings us now to the remarkable reality that 150 years after the emancipation, there are more African Americans in jail than at the peak of slavery in the 1850s. Imprisonment is not the same as slavery, you may say, but based on what we read or come to know of prison brutality, we are dealing more with a distinction than with a difference. Also, considering that prison labor is contracted to corporations who make a handsome profit out of the deal, and that for the so-called custodial industry, the greater the number of prisoners, the greater the profit. And these may sound like generalities, but let me just quote one statistics. From 1968 to 1976, no one was executed in the US. After that, both Democrats and Republicans engaged in what we call a death penalty bidding war. Consequently, the number of crimes punishable by death jumped from 1 in 1974 to 66 in 1994. But now let's return to the history of slavery. Its expansion in the US curiously coincides with the establishment and the ratification of the Constitution, as a result of which, due primarily to the way of counting people living in one state, the South dominated the presidency, and 8 out of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders. Now, still, already in the 1780s, many white Americans, under the influence of British reformers and the intellectual movement of the Enlightenment, believed that the forced enslavement of American people, subjected to the horrific so-called Middle Passage across the Atlantic, that had to stop. And indeed, importation of African slaves was made illegal, not so much due to the influence of abolitionists, but because the enslaved population had become self-reproducing. and therefore to further increase the number of slaves would have reduced their commodity value. But, waiting in the wing, so to speak, there was another issue looming: the internal forced migration of slaves. For three things occurred more or less at the same time, which we could say gave slavery a whole new dimension and expansion. One was the Louisiana Purchase of 1804, or we could say the Louisiana Sale, for it was Napoleon who put Louisiana, actually as much larger territory than Louisiana, who put Louisiana up for sale. He needed money for his plan to transform Europe into a French empire, and his plans were, once Europe was subdued, to reconquer Louisiana again, except that he did not count or anticipate the Haiti Rebellion, the first successful slave rebellion on a large scale. And this caused him to concentrate his military resources in America to maintain order in the French Antilles and to fight, quite unsuccessfully, the Haiti Rebellion. The second phenomenon was the rise of cotton as the prime raw material of the Industrial Revolution. Louisiana, Alabama, and the lands along the coast of Mexico were ideal for cotton production, while the tobacco trade was sagging among the established plantations of Virginia and surrounding countries. Cotton required extensive manpower, and accompanying the extension of slavery in the territory of the Louisiana Purchase was the forced removal of the Native Americans, leading to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, by which all Southwest Native Americans were removed to the present-day Oklahoma. The third occurrence that accelerated this process of forced mass slave migration was the invention of the cotton gin, and suddenly the stumbling block between the harvesting of cotton and the hand removal of seeds was gone. Therefore, the only limit to growth was how much land was available for growing cotton and the number of slaves available for cultivation, for weeding, for keeping, for picking, and for harvesting. And these developments created the condition for massive land speculation and the real commodification of slaves, meaning literally that the value of slaves was determined in principle and in practice by speculation. As a result of the cotton boom and the commodification of slaves, they were used, sold, or relocated according to the needs of the highest bidder. Slaves could be sold from one day to the next, families broken, brothers separated from sisters, husbands from wives, and children from mothers. Banks gave loans for the purchase of slaves, and financial instruments were created and repackaged, much as it happened recently with the housing bubble. But the cotton boom also required an increase in productivity per person, in the instance productivity per slave. And one technique to increase productivity included the use of a whip and the management technique called pushing. Briefly described, it consisted of creating a gang of pickers, assigning the fast picker to the left of the gang, as in the picture, with the others to the right in order of decreasing productivity. The overseer, armed with a whip and a gun, would then assign quotas for each member of the gang, proportional to what the overseer saw as the maximum potential for each picker. At the end of the day, the pickers weighed the amount of cotton harvested, and any difference in the number of pounds harvested between the assigned number what actually was harvested was equal to the number of whiplashes delivered to those who missed their own individual targets. As we can imagine, given the forced migration, the commodification of the slaves, and the breakup of family units, the improvement in productivity resulted in an immense human cost. 1 out of every 4 children born to slaves died before reaching the age of 1. And every new wave of forced migration reduced the life expectancy of African Americans. A notion circulated for some time that free labor would have been more productive than slavery was disposed of by facts, or disproved by facts. Free labor, motivated by wage, never produced the same volume of cotton per hour as produced by slave labor. The cotton picking index, taking the year 1810 as a starting point at 100, reached 230 by the year 1860, that is an increase of 130 times. Overseers were selected for their hardness, which makes sense if the objective was an ever-increasing productivity. And interestingly, the term torture was never used either by historians or contemporaries to describe the violence inflicted on the enslaved. The whippings and the lashings were described as disciplines in the language of the lawgivers of slavery. We have a parallel today when torture has been conveniently described as enhanced interrogation. And yesterday's tortured slaves are today's tortured enemy combatants. Here is an interesting comparison between the average price per slave and the value of cotton output per slave. The ups and downs coincide with the booms and busts following the recurring investment bubbles which after 1840 left many southern banks insolvent. And thanks to all these measures and conditions, it came about that slavery, which was almost a secondary issue at the time of independence and of the Constitution, became strengthened, magnified, and extended from 1800 onward. The abolitionist noises already heard at the time of independence were squashed because all white Americans profited directly, indirectly, or at least psychologically from the growing empire of slavery. For the growth of the empire was directly linked to the growth of slavery. And this was also reflected in an alliance between the northern and southern pro-expansion politicians, which came to dominate American politics right to the edge of the Civil War. And now, territorial expansion and the expansion of slavery were directly connected. The argument brought forward by Southern representatives was that if slavery restrictions stopped further expansion, the number of slaves would increase dramatically until a black rebellion would ensue, as it had already happened in Haiti. The point where the friction became felt was the case of the addition of the state of Missouri to the Union. Was it going to be a slave state or a free state? Eventually, as some of you may remember, the question would be resolved by the famous Missouri Compromise of 1820, whereby the state would be a slave state, but any other state north of the 36 1/5 degree parallel would be free. Interestingly, John Calhoun, a powerful pro-slavery Southern politician, stated that the Missouri crisis would prompt the South to secede and form an alliance, believe it or not, with Great Britain. In any event, the Missouri Compromise was repealed 30 years later by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. An act that opened the Kansas Territory and the Nebraskan Territory to slavery if the white settlers in those territories determined through popular vote to allow slavery in their territory, in their state. Sometimes an anecdote better than a description gives the temper of the times. The abolitionist movement never completely died, even during the greatest period of slave expansion. For example, one New Jersey Quaker by the name of Benjamin Lundy was a saddle maker by profession, and he practiced his trade in the Ohio Valley and had witnessed the forced migration of slaves linked by chains to each other in coffles, as they were called. They heard their cries of pain and distress. Moved by all this, he relocated to Baltimore, where he started printing an abolitionist newspaper, which was called The Genius of Universal Emancipation. A courageous thing to do, as Baltimore was the biggest center of domestic slave trade on the East Coast. He particularly attacked a family of enslavers, describing them as pirates, cruel, and corrupt. As he was closing the door of his newspaper shop, one member of the target family attacked him and beat him severely. Lundy survived and pressed charges against the attacker. And at the trial, the judge declared that the editor deserved chastisement. He fined the slave traders $1 and then gave a speech praising the slave trade's economic benefit to the state of Maryland. Another interesting case was that of David Walker, a freed African American who published an appeal to the colored people of the world in 1829 in Boston. He maintained, with reason, that the new form of slavery as it developed in the 19th century was worse and more cruel than the old, and he asked a pointed question: Americans, I ask you kindly, was your suffering under Great Britain 100-part as cruel as tyrannical as you have rendered ours under you? And he concluded the pamphlet with the statement to black readers that freedom is your natural right. And he plainly invited the slaves to rebel, even if rebellion meant death. "What is the use of living," he wrote, "when in fact I am dead?" Walker sold clothes, and with the clothes he sold to black sailors, he would include copies of the pamphlet to distribute when they called with their ships on southern ports to collect cotton for export. When the pamphlet became known to the authorities of the southern states, the governments banned free black sailors from disembarking from their merchant vessel. Louisiana, Georgia, and Mississippi made laws imposing the death penalty on free black people who disseminated anti-slavery material. Teaching literacy to slaves was also banned, except instructions in mathematics so that the overseers could calculate the number of lashes to deliver to the cotton picker who did not meet his daily quota. Given the condition of slaves as described, it was natural for many of them to answer the call of free black preachers so as to find in religion at least a kind of psychological soothing of their pain. But even this was considered dangerous, and Southwestern enslaved politicians put an end to an independent black Christianity. One alternative solution was the creation of slave missions where white preachers funded by white denominations would be sent to preach to black congregations. Ministers, as I mentioned before, developed theological argument whereby Christianity justified slavery. God had decreed that the Israelites and white people in general could enslave Hamitic people descended from Ham, one of Noah's sons, such as Africans are. That is, slavery was God's will. To question it was to doubt God. To oppose it was heresy. And in the next episode we will see how the slavery expansion perfectly dovetailed with the imperialistic drive to expansion with the annexation of Texas, the war on Mexico, and the country Mexico that barely escaped annexation, and the condition, and also we talk about the condition that eventually led to the Civil War and made it inevitable. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches.